Welcome, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Mhm.
So we are working at, of course, the Torah T'mimah. Rashi's up here, but we have done these Rashis, and so we are looking at the Torah T'mimah on these passages. So, and of course, we're intensely into this major halacha called circumcision. And not only is it a halacha, not only is it an element of Jewish law, but it is, as we see, it's a sign of a covenant. And that means, a very close agreement and a committed agreement between the Jewish people and God. So, verse 11. Unamaltim et basar orlatchem, you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, v'haya lאות brit, and it shall be a sign of a covenant, beini, between me, uveinechem, and you. So let's take a look at the Torah T'mimah on this. Okay. Lאות brit, as a sign of a covenant. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, said Rav Nachman, the son of Isaac. So the fact that his title is Rav and not Rabbi tells you that he's a Babylonian teacher, Babylonian authority. That's the terms for Rav, and of the time of the Gemara, of the Talmud. So after the second century. Bimilah, regarding circumcision. Ketiv ot brit, it says an ot brit, a sign of a covenant. Vedorot, and generations. In other words, that it should be an everlasting covenant. Uveshabbat, and with regards to Shabbat, right, the Sabbath. Ketiv ot brit vedorot. It also states there in the text that it is a sign of an eternal covenant. So we have circumcision, that's a sign of an eternal covenant, and dorot, generations, right? In other words, all the way through. And with Shabbat and the circumcision, we have this concept. Mikan. So from this, we have these two very different laws, but from this, lemila shedocha et haShabbat. From this, we learn that if you have a situation where a circumcision needs to be performed on the Sabbath, it overrides the Sabbath. Overrides the Sabbath. And this is in the Tractate Shabbat, page 132a. So we essentially have a conflict of laws, right? Because on Shabbat, you're not supposed to perform any type of shechita, of slaughtering or cutting or surgery or anything like that. And yet here, of course, to perform the Brit Milah, you have to do it. You have to do it. So how does he know that one overrides the other? And we're going to try and understand that better. Near Habiur, it would appear that the explanation is de kevan de kol tokef kedushat haShabbat, that the whole power of the holiness of the Sabbath, in other words, that what generates the deep sanctity of the Sabbath, hu mishum, that it is because dahu ot brit, the dorot, that it is an eternal covenant. Bein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, between the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Jewish people. Now, I want to say that in general, we are not supposed to evaluate mitzvot and say, this mitzvah is more important than this other mitzvah. We're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to understand that every single mitzvah, precisely because it comes as a command of God, is important, that every single one is important. However, we cannot get away from the fact that with regards to these two particular commandments, the Torah itself lays a special emphasis on them. I have a feeling that what connects the two of them has something to do with immortality. the fact that they are eternal covenants, that we recognize that our very existence is dependent on a supernatural, on a transcendent level of existence that allows our existence to take place. So one has to understand, if you're going to believe in at least the God of Abraham or God as we understand it as Jews, that God essentially is a transcendent power. It is a power that allows us to function. If we think it's because God created us in a way, however we want to understand that term creation, allows us to think or causes us to think. And with regards to the circumcision, I think it actually is an antidote to the sin of the Garden of Eden. That is what the snake in the Garden of Eden represents, which it does, I understand it to represent our sexual urges and how that snake can destroy us. And precisely because it also allows us to procreate, if we just simply use it to satisfy our impulses, we are going to go downhill. We will lose our immortality. And the idea, of course, of circumcision is to put a control, is to symbolize control over that urge. So there's immortality included there. And with Shabbat, because Shabbat, in order to observe it, requires us to withdraw from the physical world, to recognize this. And that's precisely what happens to us when we pass on. We withdraw from the physical world. And not only, this is not just me speculating, there are statements that say that the Sabbath is the gift that God gives us, Ma'ain Olam Haba, to give us a little foretaste of what it is like to be in this, to have withdrawn from the spiritual, from this physical world, and to be able to live within a I keep confusing this, and live on the spiritual plane. So I think this is why, at least some sense as to why this is an eternal covenant and why it is so important if we were to evaluate mitzvot. So we have both of these. So, right? So they're both of them. Ulachain, and for this reason, eina didchet mipnei mitzvah acheret. And for this reason, if one of these particular two mitzvot come into conflict with another mitzvah, with another commandment, it is not overridden. It overrides any other commandment. The imkain, and if this is the case, mikevan degam milah leot Brit, and for this reason, since circumcision is also a sign of an eternal covenant, kamo Shabbat, just as Shabbat, hare heve tokef kedushata, right? So the power of its holiness, shava likdushat Shabbat, it is equivalent to that of the holiness of the Sabbath. Mimela, and for this reason, eina nidchet bismana mipnei Shabbat. It would not be overridden on account, if it had to take place on the eighth day, on account of the Shabbat. Sorry, so it would not be overridden, right? The milah would not be overridden when it has to be done on its time, meaning on the eighth day, on account of the Sabbath. Okay. Now, of course, the fact that one takes place, we are overriding the Shabbat, it's not real clear here why you would give the preference to circumcision over the Sabbath. But at least we understand that it is a situation where one has to override the other in order to be performed. And it's possible that because, I'm simply speculating now, it's possible that because the act of circumcision is a very brief act, whereas observing the Sabbath is an act that takes place over the course of 25 hours, that because the performing even if you perform circumcision, you're still able to observe the Shabbat in every other sense except for the circumcision. That is why the circumcision overrides the Shabbat. Veda, right? And no, daha shelo gazru chachamim al milah b'Shabbat, right? And the fact that the sages did not make an edict, because a gzera means a rabbinic edict, as opposed to, this would be rabbinic law, as opposed to Torah law, okay? And they did not say that nevertheless, the circumcision should not take place on the Shabbat, right? Mechashash shema ya'avir sakin arba amot, on the concern that one might violate another element of Shabbat, which would be to transport the knife with which you're going to perform the circumcision 4 cubits, bereshut harabim, in the public domain. Shekamo shegazru b'shofar, as they made that edict regarding the shofar, v'lulav, and the lulav, mitam kazeh, on account of this particular rationale, and I will explain what we're talking about. One of the laws of the Sabbath has to do with transporting over a public domain. One is to transfer from a private domain to a public domain and vice versa. And another element is transporting something in the public domain. I'm not defining them for the moment, what we mean by a public domain or a private domain, but that one is not supposed to carry something, right? 4 cubits, in other words, about 6 feet, in a public domain. And the fact is that very often we know that Rosh Hashanah occurs on the Sabbath. The first day of Rosh Hashanah can occur on Shabbat, and you're supposed to blow the shofar on Shabbat. Sorry, on Rosh Hashanah. Please forgive me. On Rosh Hashanah. But we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The only place where it would have been blown would have been in the temple. But on Rosh Hashanah, we don't blow the shofar. And the reason we don't is because it's a rabbinic edict saying that because carrying on Shabbat violates the Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar because there's a possibility that someone will carry a shofar in order to blow it in the public domain. So there's a conflict of law, blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah on one hand, observing the Shabbat on the other hand. And again, we notice that the law of the shofar is not an eternal covenant, but the Shabbat is an eternal covenant. And so the sages said, you don't blow the shofar on the first day of Shabbat, first day of Rosh Hashanah. Likewise, if Sukkot falls on Shabbat, and inevitably it will, because it's a 7-day festival, and Sukkot, you're supposed to hold the lulav and the etrog and the willow branches and the myrtle and the citron and the palm branch. When Sukkot falls on Shabbat, likewise, we don't actually make the blessings over the lulav and the etrog for exactly the same reason. And he's saying, what we're saying is, why did they forbid the blowing of the shofar or the carrying of the lulav and the etrog, the blessings over it, if there was a conflict with a festival there, but they didn't do it here with regard to circumcision for the same kind of reason. Mishum, and the reason they didn't in this case, they said that circumcision on the 8th day, if that 8th day falls on the Sabbath, has to take place. Mishum de lechiyuv milah b'Shabbat. The reason is that regarding the obligation to perform circumcision on Shabbat, Yalfinan od, we learn that further, midrasha derosh Parshat Tazria, from an interpretation of a verse that's at the beginning of the Parsha of Tazria. That's in the book of Leviticus. Uvayom Hashmini, because there it says, and on the 8th day, Tazria deals with birth. It starts off with birth, and it says regarding the birth of a male child, it says, Uvayom Hashmini Yomor. It says, and on the 8th day he shall be circumcised. So Uvayom, right? In other words, because it says on the day, on the 8th day, and therefore we say Uvayom, it says, and on that day, Afilu b'Shabbat, that what the Torah is trying to tell us there is that even if that 8th day is on the Shabbat, Midalo Kativ Uvashmini, because it doesn't say on the 8th, it just says on the 8th day. The imkain, and if this is the case, Heve kamoshe katuv meforash, we consider it as if it was explicitly stated by Torah, on the Torah, leheter, to give us permission to do the circumcision on Shabbat, if the 8th day falls on it. V'kaimalan, and we are holding, okay, we have a principle, right? We have a principle. The davar hamefurash b'Torah leheter, that if something is explicitly stated in the Torah to give permission, ein koach lachachamim leosro, the sages do not have the authority to forbid it, because the Torah explicitly says it must take place. That's not the same case in the shofar and the lulav, right? Kamoshe katvu Tosafot, as the Tosafot wrote, the Baba Metzia, in the tractate Baba Metzia, 70b. I actually looked this up and found the reference he was talking about. And the Tosafot, of course, are Rashi's grandchildren. They're found on every page of the Vilna Gemara, the Babylonian Gemara. In the column there, and very often they may disagree with their grandpa, and very, very often they bring up issues that are new applications of Jewish law. Divrei Hamatchil, the way the Tosafot are written there is tashich. That's the word they use, the key word, to introduce their commentary there. Tashich is because that particular chapter in Baba Metzia is talking about where one may in fact charge interest, because in Deuteronomy 7 it talks about charging interest to non-Jews. Vahataz, and the Taz is Turei Zahav. We've mentioned him before, and he is a major commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, on that compendium of Jewish law. Beyorei Dea, this is the major section of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch comprises of 4 major areas of Jewish law, and Yorei Dea has to do with issues like kashrut and those issues that require expertise. You have to be an expert in order to be able to apply them. Siman Kuf Yud Zayin, and that is chapter 117, I believe. Okay. V'yein od, and see further, Masha Katuv Be'inyan Milah, and see further what we write regarding Milah b'Shabbat, circumcision on the Sabbath, Be'rosh Parshat Tazria, at the beginning of the section of Tazria in Leviticus, Pasuk Hanizkar, regarding the verse that we mentioned. So let's go on. We will not be able to do the entire next little section. Do we have any questions? Are there any questions that you want to ask me at this point?
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
It's Morris.
Yeah, Morris.
Hi.
I'm going to stop the share so we can see you, because if we stop here, it's okay. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
There's so much discussion in detail about the 8th day. The significance of Shabbos and carrying, so that you can't carry a lulav and a shofar, et cetera, et cetera. But then they come along in the Mishnaic period and create an Eruv, and based on walled cities. And then they replace a walled city with a string. So it just seems like the Torah is so specific about carrying and is adamant about even carrying a shofar from one area to another. And then they make it so easy by having walled cities. All of a sudden, your house is a community, and then a city is surrounded by a string, and you're allowed to carry. It just seems they don't gel for me.
Okay. Valid points. Okay, valid points. So,
Lee, why are you laughing?
Because let's trip up the rabbi. So let him do his thing.
I'm not pimping
He's
him.
not.
No.
He's
It's a
not.
gotcha.
It's good. I'm
Yeah,
very
no,
happy. Okay.
no, it's fine.
Me,
I agree.
me.
But the Orthodox don't carry on Shabbos even with the Eruv.
Okay, some don't. Some
Yeah,
don't.
most.
Some don't
No.
accept it. Okay. First of all, this is not my first rodeo.
No,
So I have no problem with Morris's question.
no,
And
no, 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 no.
hopefully I have an adequate answer to the question.
I'm respectful. I just enjoy the process. That's all.
That's the idea. That's exactly the idea.
Yes.
In other words, instead of watching people bash each other physically,
Yes.
okay, or to carry a pigskin, okay,
Yes.
we'd rather see them bash each other intellectually.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm
That's
not
good.
bashing.
And
That's good.
that satisfies our human need to
Great.
see competition, etc., etc.
Go for it. Okay.
So, first of all, Morris, when we talk about the definition of the domains, okay, that is part of what is going on here, okay? That I could go a step further back, and that is the idea that this is all a deconstruction of that statement in the Shema, which says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." And how do you put that? We talk love, 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 but it's a meaningless word unless we deconstruct it and say, well, what exactly is it to show love? And very often there are times when love isn't necessarily rational. Okay, it isn't necessarily logical. You have to deal both with what is logical and what involves feelings. And there's another principle that says it takes a quote from, I think, Deuteronomy, from one of Moses' speeches, and it says, "V'chayitem bahem," you shall live by them, live by these laws in the Torah, meaning you shouldn't die by them. And on the one hand, you find that the rabbis can be very strict, okay, with people who have no desire whatsoever to observe Jewish law. And on the other hand, the rabbis will be very sympathetic and try to help as much as possible someone who clearly wants to observe Jewish law, but is finding it difficult, right? And there is this sort of gray area where you have to use your judgment and decide, are you going to gain more adherence and more of a desire to accept the Torah and perform commandments if you're lenient, or are you going to destroy the Torah and destroy observance by being strict? Because I'm sure there are countless numbers of people who left observant Judaism because they felt it was too strict for them. And that is a huge, huge issue. And that is actually part of what I have to deal with as a rabbi. Because my job is lahagdil Torah ulahadira, that is to enlarge Torah, to try and encourage people to find a love for the Torah and to practice it and to make it glorious. That is my mission. That is every rabbi's mission. And how do you do that? So you want to do it in a thoughtful, very mindful kind of way. On the one hand, we talk about the laws of Shabbat. There are many laws of Shabbat, and yet very few are actually explicitly mentioned in the Torah. We have 39 principal categories of labor. These are actions that are forbidden on the Shabbat. We have derivative actions, which also are forbidden on Shabbat. And on the other hand, explicitly, we have, of course, very few explicit statements, so that we have to infer those particular ones. However, I will tell you that carrying is understood as an explicit statement because it has to do with the manna, because in that passage in the manna in Beshalach, in Exodus, it talks about the fact that the manna did not fall on the Sabbath, and the reason understood is that God did not want the Israelites to go outside the camp to get the manna and carry it back home on the Shabbat. So the idea of transfer and carrying essentially goes all the way back to the manna. Now, the rabbis determined that there are 4 different domains. There is the public domain, and there's the private domain. The private domain may be your house, but the private domain isn't defined as your house. It's defined as an area of a minimum size, okay, and also that it is surrounded in some kind of way by a demarcation, and and as opposed to the public domain, there are definitions of the public domain which essentially represent the route. If you can picture yourselves, the Israelites marching through the wilderness, 600,000 males, 20 years old and up, marching a path through the wilderness, and that is sort of the classic way to understand what a public domain is. I will tell you that, the other issues to do with the public domain, it cannot be closed-ended. So that is the second domain, the public domain. The private domain. There is something called makom patur, which means the exempt area. This is generally an area that's smaller than the minimum requirement for a private domain, okay? And in the case of an exempt area, you can transfer from an exempt area to a public area. You can transfer vice versa, and from a private domain, etc. Now, I'm giving you a very complicated explanation, and that is, the principle that to every complicated situation, there's a simple solution, and it's wrong. This is not a simple matter. Okay, I've mentioned 3 domains. There is a 4th domain called a Carmelite. A Carmelite is a domain that I believe is actually a rabbinic concept, okay, like public and private and exempt are all biblical, whereas the Carmelite I understand as a rabbinic domain, and that basically is a domain that has certain aspects of the public domain and certain aspects of the private domain. And I will give you an example to help you here. Most of the streets in your town are Carmelite. They do not satisfy the requirements of a public domain. Even though they are open to the public, that is not a sufficient definition of a public domain. On the other hand, it is open to the public, which makes it like a public domain. On the other hand, its characteristics would satisfy possibly the private domain. But the rabbis were concerned, this is why it's rabbinic, that because if I were to ask you, and you did not have this background, is a street a public domain, what would you tell me?
Yes.
It is. And that's very often an issue for the rabbis. They're very concerned about confusion that people have. And again, if you say, wait a second, what are we doing here? I would go back to saying this has to do with loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So that these kinds of things are actually interesting and important and aren't boring and over-detailed, etc., etc., etc. So I'm giving you a very long answer to your question.
Rabbi, we need to
Yes.
change the subject before we go and before we
Yes,
lose
we
more
do, and
people.
I know what you do. Today happens to be Harlan's or Harriet's birthday, and we want to wish him a happy birthday. And let me dedicate this long answer I'm giving you. May it represent Harlan's long, please God, life, that he is well into his 90s, and he is amazing. He's an amazing person. And here he is participating in this.
He's
So,
96.
Happy birthday.
amazing.
Happy birthday to
And
you.
may you have many happy returns in
Happy
good
birthday.
health, Harlan. Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi. 4 more years, I'll have you 100, and then
Aye.
I'll celebrate my birthday at the
There
shul.
we go. There we go.
Big birthday bang.
There we go. Okay.
If God
So
lets me live to 100.
thank you, Lauren, for bringing me back to earth. Morris, are you relatively satisfied with the answer I've given you so far? Because I could keep going,
Yeah,
but
keep going. Keep going.
All right. So
Because you lost
yeah.
the fourth element.
Sorry, the fourth.
The fourth element is neither public nor
Carmelite.
private.
It's called the Carmelite, and it has the qualities of both domains.
Well, Rabbi, if you're living in an apartment, what about the hallway?
So now you're creating. Okay, so, right. Okay, so the Eruv. You asked me about the Eruv. The word Eruv actually means blend, and that's why the evening is called Erev, because it's a blend of light and darkness. So essentially, it seems to me, and I do not speak as an expert, I have a certain level of knowledge, but it seems to me you cannot turn a public domain into a private domain. You cannot turn a private domain into a public domain. But you can, when it comes to a Carmelite, if you take a step further, you can turn it into a private domain. And because those streets, okay, are not public domain, right? By putting up a demarcation that can be seen, you can turn it into a legal private domain. And because you are allowed to carry in a private domain, whereas you're not allowed to carry in a public domain, this is how the Eruv works. Now, not all Jews accept this. Not all observant Jews accept this particular concept the way it's being done. But by and large, I would say that most Orthodox Jews would accept this particular mode of turning a Carmelite into a private domain.
Okay. But it seems to me that, from my experience, that the Orthodox use the Eruv more on holidays than they do on Shabbat.
That may be because the laws of the holidays are slightly easier. For example, very specifically, you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat, but you are allowed to cook. It says in the Torah, you are permitted to cook food and prepare food on the holidays, on a Yom Tov.
Mm-hmm.
Are the other restrictions of Shabbat apply for the most part? Yes, they do. Okay? But on a Yom Tov. But when it comes to cooking, it doesn't. And that's a very big leniency on the part of a Yom Tov as opposed to Shabbat. Now, there are restrictions to that too. That is to say, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov for the sake of Yom Tov. You're not supposed to say, oh, I have that dinner party next Wednesday night, so because I'm allowed to cook on Yom Tov, I'm going to prepare stuff for that dinner party I'm having next Wednesday night, which is not falling on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to do that. The question becomes, what happens if a Yom Tov is followed by a Shabbat? Right? We got circumstances alter cases. So technically, on the one hand, you're not supposed to prepare on Yom Tov for a day that follows. That's not Yom Tov. But you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. So now you've got 3 days, okay, where presumably you cannot prepare a food for the Sabbath. That's a problem. You're not supposed to cook. You're not supposed to fast on the Sabbath. So again, what you want to do is you want to take something and combine it. And that is before Yom Tov, you take some food, right, that you have that's going to require preparation and prepare it before the Yom Tov even starts and say, this is food that I'm going to eat on the Sabbath. And then at that point, because you have already started that process, you can continue it into Yom Tov and prepare for Shabbat. But presumably, some of that food is going to be eaten on the Sabbath. So again, it's a way of trying to act in a very mindful way about these laws and to take them very seriously. You ask yourself on the other side of things, people don't take the laws of the Torah very seriously. And the question then becomes, well, can you really say you're loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might? Can you really say that sincerely? That's a deep question. That is a deep question. By the way, it goes further than that. Very, very recently, I realized the difference between Adonai and Elohim, right? The term for Adonai. To be as quick as I can over this, the term Adonai has to do with God's transcendent existence. In other words, if you believe in Adonai, it means you believe that there is a transcendent creator to the universe. What about Elohim? Elohim has to do with the relationship you have with that transcendent creator. In other words, you can certainly believe in a transcendent creator, doesn't mean you have any relationship with that. On the other hand, if you see yourself as being bound to that transcendent creator, at least through Judaism, it would be through those commandments. That is a way in which you bind yourself to that transcendent creator. So when you say Adonai Eloheinu, you are in the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu. You're saying that you are accepting Elohim, right? Sorry, Adonai as your Elohim. That you are willing through your life to bind yourself. And that's why you say Eloheinu. You don't say Adonainu. The term Adonai exists independently of whether you believe in it or you don't believe in it or whatever. But whether God is your Elohim depends on you. And in a sense, if I were to tell you the whole phrase and what it means now, as I understand it, and it's taken me a lifetime essentially to figure it out, okay, is that you're addressing Jacob, Shema Yisrael, you're saying, hear Jacob, Adonai Eloheinu, that the Adonai, who is your Elohim and my Elohim, right, is our Elohim. Adonai Echad is the same one Elohim, same one Adonai. That's what you're saying when you're declaring Shema. So if you don't perform mitzvot, when you don't perform mitzvot, of course, if you don't understand what you're saying, it's not going to make all that much difference. But if you do understand what you're saying, it places a certain moral obligation on you and a challenge. And that is the challenge. And I just recently read about how Abraham was always worried. Abraham, right? Abraham, of all people, was worried whether or not he was, in fact, accepting God as his Elohim. He was worried about it. But there's a proverb or something that says that the wise man worries about these sorts of things. And an unwise person, doesn't at all and just feels very confident about what they're doing. So it's live and learn. Live and learn.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. Well,
and I'm not sure if I should follow that with an apology, Morris.
why an apology?
Well, it was a very long answer, very
it's a long
answer to. No, your question was not long. Your question was right on. Honest.
No, I mean, it's a complicated question.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
It is. It is a complicated question, which is now you can understand why Mead was chuckling.
Yes.
So
I think Mead just likes to chuckle at me.
No.
No,
He chuckles at all of us. Let me stop the recording at this point.